My mom looked at me and whispered, "He's not coming back." And in that moment, everything I believed about family quietly collapsed inside me. My name is Kayla Mitchell. I was 17 when my life stopped feeling safe, in ways I never knew how to explain out loud, and what happened inside our home that night would shape every part of the person I later became. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, inside a working-class family that never had much, but always tried to hold things together with effort and routine. At first, my mother's health problems felt like something we could manage, but the bills kept multiplying, the treatments became more demanding, and the tension in our home stopped being silent. It became heavy, unavoidable, and slowly started changing the way my father looked at both of us. My dad began staying out longer, coming home later without explanations, avoiding conversations that used to be normal, and treating responsibility like something that belonged to someone else. I remember standing in the hallway that night while my mother struggled to sit upright, watching his hands shake slightly as he grabbed his jacket. He didn't look at her. He barely looked at me. "I'm tired of this life. I'm not staying anymore," my dad said without raising his voice, without hesitating, as if abandoning us was a decision he had already made a long time ago. That was the moment my childhood ended, quietly, without noise or drama, just one door closing and a silence that never lifted again. If you're watching and want to understand what happens when someone walks away from the people who needed them the most, make sure you stay with this story, subscribe to the channel, and share where you're watching from in the comments. After he left, the house stopped feeling like home. My mother's health began to fall apart faster than I was ready to understand, and every small routine we had relied on started to disappear quietly. At first, she tried to act strong in front of me, but the pain showed through the way she struggled to stand, the way her hands trembled when she held a glass of water, and the way her voice sounded thinner each time she tried to reassure me that everything would be okay. I started noticing problems that no one talked about out loud, especially when I found stacks of unopened mail pushed behind the kitchen drawer, all marked with late fees and warnings that felt heavier than their envelopes. My father's absence was more than physical by that point, because I began to see strange charges on the old bank statements he had left behind, withdrawals that made no sense for our situation, purchases that had nothing to do with groceries, utilities, or medicine. I did not need anyone to explain it to me because the pattern was too clear to ignore. There came a morning when Mom admitted we could not keep the house anymore because the money simply was not there, and the fear that rose in her voice made me understand how serious everything had become. I helped her pack small things while she tried to rest between waves of pain, and I avoided crying because I believed if I cried, she would lose whatever strength she had left to stand. That was when my grandmother Eleanor was introduced into my life, in a way I never expected or wanted. She did not hesitate when she opened the door for us, and she did not ask difficult questions because she already understood enough. She told us we could stay as long as we needed, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were allowed to breathe again, even though I could feel how fragile that safety really was. Living in Eleanor's home changed the air around me in a way I could not explain to anyone, because suddenly, I was no longer just a daughter who listened. I became someone who watched every detail of my mother's breathing, every flicker of pain in her eyes, every moment when she tried to hide her fear so that I would not break. I started to sit closer to her, even in silence, to learn how to distract her when the nights felt too long, and to hold my own thoughts inside whenever I felt like screaming. The hardest part was realizing that no one was coming to save us, and that the comfort of childhood had been replaced by a responsibility that grew heavier with every passing week. I began to understand that laughter felt different now, that school felt distant, that normal conversations with friends were impossible to explain, because my world had narrowed into hospital forms, quiet meals, and long pauses where my father's name was never spoken. At that moment, I knew something inside me had shifted in a way that would never return to the way it was before. I was not just living inside a broken family anymore. I was learning how to stand between fear and survival, between weakness and strength. Because if I did not protect my mother's spirit, no one else would. 2 years later, the last bit of safety disappeared. Eleanor passed away quietly, and there was no dramatic moment that prepared me for what came next. Only a phone call that made the air in my chest feel thin and unfamiliar. Her absence did not feel like grief in the way people describe it. It felt like the floor underneath my life had been pulled away while I was still standing on it, trying to understand how to stay upright. Mom became more fragile in ways that could not be hidden anymore, and I realized very clearly that she could not exist safely in the world without someone beside her. She forgot small things that used to be automatic. She struggled to keep track of her medication, and sometimes she stared at me as if she was trying to memorize my face, in case she lost parts of herself that she could not afford to lose. I stopped thinking about what I wanted and started thinking only about what she needed, because the fear of her being alone with her pain felt heavier than the fear of losing my own future. The medical costs kept rising without mercy, and no amount of careful planning seemed to slow them down in any way that mattered. There came a quiet afternoon when I sat alone at the small table with school papers in front of me, and I understood that I could not keep pretending that education was still possible. The decision did not feel dramatic or heroic. It felt like choosing between breath and silence, because without money, there would be no treatment, and without treatment, there would be no mom as I knew her. I walked into my first job with hands that felt too small and a mind that felt too old, trying to smile at people who had no idea what was sitting behind my eyes. The work itself was not important. What mattered was that every hour translated into a little more stability, a little more time, and a little more medicine that Mom would not have to go without. I learned very quickly how to hide my exhaustion, how to listen without speaking, and how to move through long shifts while keeping my thoughts organized enough to survive. No one taught me how to manage money or time or fear, so I learned by making mistakes that felt too serious to afford a second chance. I wrote things down late at night. I counted every small expense. I divided hours between work-home hospitals and whatever sleep I could collect, without fully collapsing inside my own head. I stopped expecting anyone to explain things to me because there was no one left who had time to guide me or energy to soften the edges of reality. The strangest part was how quiet everything became, not peaceful quiet, but the kind of silence that presses against your chest while you are trying to breathe normally. I stopped talking about the future. I stopped imagining what life might look like later. Each day turned into a list of tasks that had to be completed in the right order, or something important would fall apart, and failing was not an option I could explore safely. I understood that I was no longer a student waiting to be taught, or a child waiting to be protected, or a daughter who could lean on anyone stronger than herself. I had crossed into something colder and more rigid, a life built around responsibility, survival, and the quiet agreement I made with myself to keep going, no matter how tired I felt. By the time I accepted that this was my reality, I was no longer asking why any of it happened. I was only asking how to last one more day without letting Mom see how afraid I had become. By the time I started to feel like an adult, my body already knew what exhaustion tasted like. Work stopped being something I went to and became something that lived inside me, pressing into my shoulders when I woke up and tightening my chest long before I reached the end of each shift. I learned how to move on very little sleep while keeping my face calm, because no one at work needed to see how fragile everything felt inside. There were days when my hands shook while I counted change or filled forms, yet I kept going because every hour meant another bottle of medicine, another quiet night without panic replacing oxygen in our home. Caring for Mom turned into a second full-time life that no one trained me for. I learned how to help her stand when her legs refused to cooperate, how to organize her pills without letting her notice how scared I felt when the bottles looked too empty, how to clean and cook while pretending my mind was not constantly calculating what would happen if I lost this job. There was no help coming from family on either side, and no unexpected support arriving at the door, so I accepted that everything rested on me and adjusted my breathing until it felt normal. It was during this stretch of quiet survival that I first leaned on my best friend Denise Parker, not for solutions, but simply for proof that the world still held someone who understood I was human, even when I stopped acting like it. Denise never told me what to do or how to fix my family. She simply listened without judgment and sat beside me in silence when my words stopped working. Her presence felt like a thin rope tied around my wrist, not strong enough to pull me out, but enough to keep me from completely slipping away. There were moments when I almost believed I could collapse in front of Denise and be honest about how afraid I felt. Yet I never crossed that line because some part of me understood that my strength had to remain something I practiced rather than something I was given. She reminded me to eat when my hands forgot what hunger felt like, and she spoke about ordinary things when my thoughts became too heavy, which helped more than any advice ever could. Little by little, I stopped expecting Dad to appear at the door or call my name from some corner of memory. I accepted that he had chosen a life that no longer included us, and while the thought still hurt, it stopped controlling my sleep or my decisions. I stopped wasting energy on questions that had no answers and began putting that energy into paying bills on time, learning which corners could be cut safely, and building a rhythm that kept both Mom and me steady enough to survive. There were nights when I lay awake listening to Mom's quiet breathing just to confirm she was still there. And on those nights, I understood that survival was not dramatic or heroic. It was simply choosing to stand up again the next morning without applause. I learned how to move through exhaustion without slowing down, how to speak gently when my patience felt thin, and how to look forward without wasting time on what had already moved beyond my reach. By the end of this period of my life, I no longer felt like someone waiting for rescue. I felt like someone who had built a small but solid way of living with her own hands, her own discipline, and her own silent promises. I had not become fearless. I had become steady, and that steadiness felt more real than any comfort I had ever known before. That was when I understood that surviving was no longer a temporary phase in my life. It had become my nature. 10 years passed without his name being spoken. By that point in my life, silence about my father no longer felt like something I was forcing myself to carry. It had settled into my routine so quietly that I barely noticed it anymore, like a room in a house that had been locked for years and no longer felt familiar when I glanced at the door. My days became steady in a way I had never experienced before. I woke up early, prepared Mom's medication carefully, drove to work without panic in my chest, finished full shifts without wondering what bill would go unpaid that month, then returned home to a calm that felt earned instead of accidental. My job was not impressive on paper, but it gave me stability I had never known as a teenager. I could cover rent without fear. I could handle medical costs without shaking hands. I could schedule Mom's appointments based on what she needed, rather than what we could afford. That kind of control changed everything quietly. Life stopped feeling like something I was surviving minute by minute, then started feeling like something I was managing on my own terms. Mom's health did not suddenly improve, but it stopped feeling like a constant emergency. She moved slower, spoke less, rested more, yet she trusted me without hesitation. She let me handle every form, every phone call, every difficult conversation. Between us, there was an unspoken understanding that we had lived through something that could not easily be explained to anyone outside these walls. We rarely talked about the worst years, choosing instead to focus on everyday routines that made our home feel stable. One afternoon, something shifted. I ran into an old acquaintance outside a grocery store, someone who had known my parents back when our family still looked normal to the outside world. His voice lowered when he spoke to me, his eyes uncertain as if he was debating whether he should continue. He told me that the woman who had been living with my father had recently passed away, speaking carefully, like he was afraid of how the information might land. I did not press for details, but he continued anyway. He explained that my father tried to run a small business while she was sick, that the business slowly collapsed under the weight of unpaid bills, that debts grew until they became impossible to control, and that the house was eventually lost along with any sense of stability. By the time he finished talking, the story felt complete in a way I had never asked for. Driving home that day felt different from any normal afternoon. I did not feel sadness. I did not feel relief. Instead, I noticed a quiet sense of unease creeping in beneath the surface of the peace I had worked so hard to build. Hearing that he had lost everything did not make me feel strong or victorious. It made me cautious, like I had just learned that a long, sealed door somewhere behind me had started to shift slightly without being opened. I chose not to tell Mom right away. She had built a fragile sense of calm that did not need to be disturbed by news about a man who had not existed in her life for years. Bringing his collapse back into our home felt unnecessary, so I protected her by keeping it to myself. Over the next few weeks, I noticed changes in how I moved through the world. I became more careful about locking doors. I paused longer when unknown numbers showed up on my phone. I watched strangers in parking lots without fully understanding why. I did not miss him. I felt no desire to reach out, but there was a quiet question settling somewhere deep inside me that had never been asked before. Even with that feeling, I refused to pull old memories back into the center of my life. I did not search for him. I did not ask where he was living. I did not look through social media or reach out to anyone connected to him. I held on to my routine tightly because routine had kept me alive when comfort never could. At that point, I understood something about myself with complete clarity. I was no longer the child waiting for answers. I was no longer the teenager wondering how to survive another month. I had become a woman who built stability from exhaustion, who carried responsibility without help, and who protected her mother through discipline instead of hope. The memories stayed locked away, controlled, unable to touch me unless I chose to let them in. One quiet afternoon, the air felt heavier than usual, not because of weather, but because of a feeling I could not explain or push away. I was in the kitchen rinsing a cup that Mom had forgotten on the counter earlier that morning, listening to the low sound of the old clock marking time, in a way that felt slow, careful, almost cautious. The house had become a place of steady routine, shaped by years of silence, responsibility, and survival, that no longer frightened me, but still lived quietly inside my chest like something that never fully slept. The knock came softly, not urgent, not confident, like fingers that were unsure whether they belonged there or had the right to ask. I paused longer than I meant to before moving forward, because something inside me already understood what my mind was trying to avoid. When I opened the door, I saw him standing on the small concrete step that had once felt too small for his presence and too fragile to hold the man he used to be. Dad looked smaller than I remembered, not only in posture but in presence. His shoulders curved forward in a way that did not match the man I had stored in memory across all those silent years. His hair had gone gray unevenly, his face looked tired in a way that sleep could not fix, and his eyes did not carry that old sense of control that used to fill the room without effort. His coat hung loosely on his thin frame, as if it once belonged to someone else with more strength, more certainty, more direction. He did not step forward. He did not smile. He only looked at me as if he had traveled a long way inside himself before ever arriving at our door. Behind me, I heard the light sound of Mom's steps. She had always learned to move quietly over the years, like a person who did not want to disturb the fragile piece of a house that had taken years to rebuild. She reached the doorway and saw him immediately. Her body went still, not frozen by fear, but locked by memory. He spoke before I could think. His voice was softer than I expected, cracked by something deeper than age. "I just want to see her." The words fell into the space between them like fragile glass. Mom did not move. She did not lower her eyes. She did not soften in any way that could be mistaken for weakness. "No," she said. Her voice was calm, yet firm enough to close every hidden door he might have hoped to open. "You do not get to come back inside." Dad shifted his weight as if the ground under him had stopped feeling real. He looked at her, then looked at the familiar wall behind her, then lowered his gaze as if he had lost the right to ask for more. "I only wanted a minute," he said quietly, but Mom did not answer. She simply stepped closer to me, her presence steady, her silence final. He slowly turned his eyes toward me. That was when I saw something else inside his face. Not anger, not pride. Only a quiet kind of desperation that did not beg loudly but still felt dangerous. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for my arm. He only waited like a stranger afraid of crossing an invisible line. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, not because I wanted distance from Mom, but because I wanted to protect her from any sound that might weaken her resolve. The air outside felt unfamiliar cooler, as if the world had shifted slightly just because he was standing there. The space between us felt wide enough to hold everything that had never been said, everything that had never been owned. We stood in silence for a few seconds that felt longer than they should have. He looked at the ground, then at my face, then away again, like someone deciding whether truth was safe enough to touch. "I never meant to disappear like that," he said quietly, his voice careful as if it might break if he pushed it too hard. "I thought I could fix things once I got away. I thought I could come back stronger with something to offer instead of being a burden." I listened without interrupting him. I did not fold my arms. I did not step back. I simply let him speak, because silence had taught me how to stand still without softening. "She promised me things," he continued, his words slower, heavier. "She said everything would be easier. She said I deserved more than a life of hospitals and bills." At first, it felt like breathing again. I let myself believe it. I looked at him steadily, not with anger, not with pity, but with the calm that only comes after something has already broken and been survived. "Mom did not deserve to be left with fear and silence," I said finally. "I did not deserve to grow up inside a house that felt like it was always about to fall apart." He nodded slowly, like he already knew that argument had no ending he could win. "I was ashamed," he said. "I did not know how to come back once I realized what I had done. I kept thinking I would return when I had something worth bringing with me. Then time kept moving and I stayed stuck." I shook my head once gently. "You do not get forgiven just because you finally understand what you broke." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again with a tired acceptance that felt real. "I am not asking to be forgiven," he said. "I just needed to say it out loud before I disappear again for real this time." The air felt steady around us, not tense, not soft, just clear. "I do not hate you," I told him, because it was the truth. "But I also do not need you, and I will not open my life to someone who chose absence when presence mattered most." He nodded slowly, carefully, as if he had expected that answer more than any other. "I understand," he said. I stepped back toward the door. This time I did not hesitate. I did not feel torn. I did not feel lost. I felt finished. When I opened the door and stepped back inside, I did not look back. Not because I was afraid to, but because I finally knew I did not owe him another second of my life. Months later, the world around me felt steady in a way that did not depend on hope or fear, but on acceptance that some people only exist in your life to teach you what you must learn alone. I did not ask where he went after that afternoon, because knowing no longer felt necessary to my peace. I had already walked far enough to understand that closure does not always come from answers, but from silence that feels strong instead of empty. I heard small pieces of his life through quiet channels that were never meant to reach me directly. A former neighbor mentioned seeing him waiting near a bus stop with a worn bag that looked heavier than it should have been. Another voice spoke about him sleeping in a room that he rented week by week, never staying long enough to build familiarity with the walls around him. There was no stable job, only short work that ended before it could become routine, leaving him in a pattern of uncertainty that followed him like a shadow. I did not feel satisfaction when I learned those things. I did not feel anger either. What I felt was distance, the kind of distance that protects rather than separates. I understood that whatever remained of his life belonged to him alone, shaped by choices that no longer touched my hands or my heart. I did not carry curiosity, because curiosity would have pulled me back to a place that no longer existed for me. Inside our home, Mom stayed unchanged in her strength. She never asked about him, never spoke his name, never showed signs of regret for the door she had closed. Her routine continued with quiet dignity, her mornings filled with calm habits, her evenings marked by peaceful rest that she had earned through years of endurance. I watched her move through the house with the confidence of a woman who had learned that protecting your peace sometimes requires permanent decisions. She did not soften over time. She did not wonder aloud. Her refusal was not built on bitterness but on clarity that had settled deep into her spirit. I respected that clarity because it taught me that strength is not always loud, but often lives inside simple choices made every day. My own life moved forward without hesitation. I worked, I planned. I built days that did not depend on apology or explanation. I stopped waiting for words that would never be enough. I stopped imagining conversations that would never change anything real. My independence was not an act of rebellion anymore, but a quiet state of being that felt natural, like breathing without effort. I began to notice that the absence of expectation gave me a kind of freedom I had never known before. I could make decisions without wondering how they would be judged by someone who had abandoned responsibility. I could dream without fearing that those dreams would be dismissed. My identity stopped being shaped by loss, and instead began to grow from self-respect. Sometimes I thought about the idea of forgiveness not as an action for him, but as a gift to myself. I understood that forgiveness does not require reunion, does not require words, does not require contact. It only requires letting go of the weight that does not belong to you anymore. In that quiet understanding, I felt something settle inside me that had been restless for a long time. He lived somewhere in the world, walking through days that no longer touched mine. Mom remained exactly where she belonged, surrounded by peace she had fought hard to create. I stayed where I chose to stand, not as a daughter waiting for a father, but as a woman who had learned how to live without waiting for anyone. Some people will only love you when it is easy, but real strength is built when you learn to live without their presence. Walking away does not make you cold, it makes you honest about what you deserve. Forgiveness does not always require reunion, and healing does not always come from answers. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept the silence, protect your peace, and choose yourself without guilt. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this journey touched your heart, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a moment where choosing silence became your strongest decision? Share your experiences and let us know what you learned from this story. Your voice matters here.